A Conversation on Consciousness with Professor Michael Graziano. Professor Michael Graziano is Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Princeton University, studying the brain basis of awareness. He is also a surrealist novelist, composer of symphonies and string quartets, and ventriloquist puppeteer. Professor Graziano proposed attention schema theory, AST, as explanation of how and for what adaptive advantage brains attribute the property of awareness to themselves. He proposed that specialized machinery in the brain computes the feature of awareness and attributes it to other people in a social context as well as to oneself. AST seeks to explain how an information processing machine could act this way, insisting it has consciousness, describing consciousness in the ways we do, and claiming an inner magic transcending information processing, even though it does not.
Dive right in.
Go for it.
Okay, we are recording right now. And actually, it was a friend of mine who recommended that I talk to you. His name is Mike Cerullo, and he's been writing about consciousness a bit, at least in the circles that I travel in. He's a psychiatrist by training, but he found your recent article particularly interesting. That's about attention schema theory.
Right.
And so I would love to start there, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about your recent work and about attention schema theory.
So just to tell you, it's a little hard to talk about it without giving a little bit of packaging around it about the context of attention research in general. Will that be okay if I kind of start more
totally.
on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
All right.
Go ahead.
So So what is consciousness? This is a topic that people have struggled with, obviously, for a very long time. What is consciousness? And I think the way people have thought about it has changed over time. But right now, there are kind of two different ways that the field has moved. And one kind, I think of it as kind of the magicalist way of thinking. And the other kind is the mechanist way of thinking. And there are more people on the magicalist way of thinking than entirely realize it. There's a lot of people who have those magicalist theories but don't quite realize they're magicalist. And they go sort of like this. Let's start by assuming that we have some kind of experience essence inside of us, and it's fundamentally non-physical. And we can ask, how does it arise? How is it that information flowing through our heads achieves a state of subjective experience, conscious experience, and where that conscious experience is a fundamentally non-physical feeling? How does that happen? And this is the central question of consciousness as many people have framed it. And now you can study that and ask, well, what does it correlate with? What networks in the brain might produce it? How does it emerge? But the experience itself, the conscious experience itself, is fundamentally not understandable because it is fundamentally not a physical thing that you can study any further. Right, that whole approach assumes that there's a kind of magical essence. Now, how does it relate to the brain? Okay, and that's one entire approach, and almost every theory of consciousness over the past 100 years has basically fit into that category. There's an entirely separate approach to consciousness, which is we're machines, we're biological machines, very complicated machines. And one of the things we do is we think that we have a non-physical essence inside of us. Why do we think that? What good does it do the machine to build that self-description and then attach so much certainty to that self-description? That's a totally different approach, which does not presuppose the existence of a non-physical magic. That says the question is, why do we think that we have magic, not how do we get magic? Or to put it another way, the philosopher Chalmers has been playing with this exact kind of thinking. He defined the idea of he coined the term the hard problem. A hard problem, meaning how do we have this magic essence, basically. And he has also talked quite recently extensively about what he calls the meta problem, which is, why do we think there is a hard problem to begin with? And that's the question that I focus on, that my lab is focused on. How do we understand engineering or building a machine that thinks it has a non-physical essence inside of it, and what cognitive use is it to have that kind of self-model? And so the theories that I work on are all about that. They're engineering and cognitive theories about how an information processing machine works better when it has simplified, really cartoonish self-models. I don't know if you want to ask further.
That's a great introduction, because that's definitely the split that I see as I'm talking to people who have thought about consciousness in different ways. So we have our, I guess, experimentalists, engineers, those of us at carboncopies.org who are really interested in whole brain emulation and that idea that really this is a machine, and if the machine thinks that it is experiencing something, then that's because that's an aspect of how the machine is working and what it's telling itself and which labels it's attaching to it and things like that, which is perhaps a simplification to talk about it that way. But still, I'm trying to say that we're coming at it from the same direction that you're talking about here.
Yes.
So more, say, Daniel Dennett's point of view, that there is no Cartesian theater.
Yes, exactly.
Right, rather than the alternative approach where, say, someone like Max Tegmark will start to think about new states of physics or matter or something like that to explain where consciousness is coming from.
Yes.
And Tononi and Koch, they're sort of on the, I would say,
very
on
much.
the fence there.
No, I would not say they're on the fence. They're very explicitly on the what I would call the magicalist end.
The magicalist side. Okay, I'd be really interested to talk about that some more in a moment. Would you mind explaining a little bit about attention schema theory?
Sure. So my interest was this: if we're machines that think we have this funny magic essence inside of us, why? What good is that? And generally, when the brain builds information, chunks of information about itself or about the world, what it's doing is building a model of something real. And it's useful to model that real thing, to keep track of it, monitor it, simulate it. But what is that real thing that's being modeled? And the theory that we arrived at is actually based on a long line of evidence in the literature, the relationship between attention and consciousness. And it turns out that almost always, but not 100% of the time, almost always, what you attend to, which means what the neurons in your brain have focused their resources on mechanistically, what the brain is focused is processing on, tends to match what you claim to have a subjective experience of. So subjective experience and attention tend to co-occur. And so this idea emerged that we say we're subjectively aware of something because that's the brain's way of keeping track of what its mechanistic attention is doing. So again,
but using a self-model. Self-model of attention.
Right.
Yeah.
So attention here, I always have trouble with that word. I don't like the word because it has too many colloquial connotations. And I mean something really mechanistic. I mean some signals are enhanced at the expense of other signals. And the enhanced signals are processed in great depth and then impact behavior. That's attention. So the brain pays attention. Attention is so mechanistic. We know how to build it. People have built many artificial devices that can focus their attention. But what we're suggesting is the brain doesn't just use attention. It also builds a little cartoonish model of attention. And it tells itself, my resources are focused on X, the coffee cup, for example, right? But here's the thing. The brain doesn't need to know details, right? Give you an example of a different model the brain builds: color. So in reality, the world is full of wavelengths, which are very complicated. and that is processed by the eyes and the brain constructs color. Color is a construct of the brain, and it doesn't exist in the real world. It's a simplification. It's a proxy for a more complex reality, and it's good enough for basic survival. So there's a basic principle. The brain constructs simplified, almost cartoonish models of things in the world. And it does it for efficiency, because it'd be a total waste of energy for the brain to construct the details of photons and electromagnetic interactions. Like, it doesn't need to know that. So now, how does the brain build a model of attention? Well, attention in reality is 86 billion neurons interacting with each other in a complicated way. The brain doesn't need to know that. It doesn't need to know anything about neurons or synapses or brain areas. So it constructs a much higher level cartoonish description that says there's a non-physical floaty thing in me that has a mental grasp of something that allows me to understand and react to it. So that's the brain's cartoonish, simplified, efficient model, self-model of what it means to pay attention to something. And thus the explanation for why attention and subjective experience almost always track each other, because one is modeling the other. One's a representation of the other. And so in a nutshell, that's the theory, the attention schema theory, that what we call awareness is a schematic, cartoonish model the brain builds of attention. And there you have the core idea.
So in that sense, then, consciousness, the way we experience it, is an illusion in the same sense that vision, the way we experience it, is an illusion because it's not quite what we think it is. It perhaps manifests in a way different from what's really happening there. Let's say, in the sense that, say, in vision, you imagine that you have an entire image in front of you, but really you have these saccades going around and you're grabbing a little bit here and a little bit there, and you feel like you have an image of the entire world there. Would that be correct to say that consciousness is kind of an illusion in that sense?
Right, yes. So I'm always very careful about the word illusion. And I end up getting into arguments with my colleagues because there are people out there who say consciousness is an illusion. So Dan Dennett is one of these people. Yeah. Consciousness is an illusion. And I always get into arguments with him. And they're very strange arguments because we end up agreeing on almost everything except the word itself. Just the word illusion. And the reason why I don't like the word illusion is because when most people hear it, they think there's nothing there. It just seems like there's something there. And
right, but it doesn't mean that. It means it's different than you think it is. Yeah.
Exactly. There is something there. There is a stream of consciousness, in a sense. There's information up here, but we think what we think it is introspectively is a little different from what it actually is. So, and in that sense, yes. So I'm always very circumspect when I use the word illusion. It's kind of like an illusion, but some people might take the word the wrong way. So I'm always careful with that word. But what you're saying is exactly right. Yes.
Yeah, I take the word not from Dan Dennett, but from Susan Blackmore, the way she describes that it's something different, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess one of the things that I find is often bothersome when I'm talking to people who are making theories about consciousness or assumptions about consciousness is that they will make assumptions about things that are apparently happening in the moment. So, for instance, they'll think, at this moment, I am consciously aware of everything I'm hearing, seeing, feeling, and so forth. And I ask, how do you know that this is actually happening in the moment? How do you know this isn't a post hoc experience, that this isn't something where unconscious processes throughout your brain have been calculating all sorts of things, and then you're collecting these results and putting them in a working memory buffer that you've now just checked when you thought to yourself, what was I aware of? And this is something that I don't really know how to explain typically when I get into a conversation. I wonder, is this something that you've encountered as well? And how would you tackle this, because this is something that I feel is also at the base of, say, integrated information theory and many of these other approaches that assume that there has to be an enormous amount that is happening physically at the same time.
Right. I do think that's basically, yes, that's a confusion. So first, harkening back a little to something you said earlier, I think we do suffer from an illusion that we experience a great deal more than we actually do. And vision is the perfect example, where the eye is roving around, picking out one little detail at a time, and we think we see everything in the room simultaneously. And that's obviously not true. And there's wonderful examples of how that's not true. I mean, just to give one example, and I'm sure you know this, but for your listeners, the famous basketball gorilla experiment, where people are told to watch a basketball game and count how many times the ball passes from person to person. And they go through that whole exercise, and then you ask them, did you see anything strange? And they say, no, but I saw everything there. I saw the whole game. And then you say, okay, this time don't concentrate on who's holding the ball. Just look around. And they see the whole film again, and they realize a guy in a gorilla suit was walking through the whole game. They missed it because they're not attending to it, and they didn't process it. It didn't enter their consciousness. And so consciousness is this tiny little teeny window around attention that picks up little bits. So the vast majority of information being processed never gets into what we call consciousness, but we don't know. I mean, tautologically, we're only conscious of what gets into consciousness. And so we suffer from this self-limiting window. So I think you're exactly right there. The theories like IIT, like integrated information theory, I should say, they may suffer from that, but I think they have other problems. I think there's a more fundamental problem there. The more fundamental problem is the framing of the question is, what causes the feeling to arise? Right? As soon as you're framing the question that way, what causes the feeling to arise? Then I think you're on the wrong track, because you've presupposed that there is this non-physical feeling. And now you can start to ask, well, maybe it's very low-level processing, so that there's a feeling attached to everything that comes in through my eyes, but only some of it reaches my speech. You know, that's one approach that would be like the phenomenal consciousness versus the access consciousness. So this vast field of everything around us of which we're conscious, but only a limited amount of it reaches our cognition, right? But this whole approach presupposes that there is such a thing as a non-physical floaty feeling that emerges out of it. And as soon as you assume that, I think you paint yourself into a corner. You run yourself out of business in terms of science. I mean, it might make good spiritual philosophy or something, but you've abandoned the way of science, right?
Right,
and so I think you're exactly right. The question is, there's lots of processing of stuff, and at some point, some of that stuff links up with some other set of information, and the machine then starts spitting out reports or constructing thoughts that say, I have a conscious experience attached to this and attached to that. And so we can ask, what's computing those bundles of information? And what are the circuits?
Yeah, I think this is, to me, the very difficult part, because there are, of course, a lot of people who want to be very scientific about the way they approach the brain and consciousness, and they want to be very careful that they're tackling the whole thing as rationally as possible. And yet, it's extremely difficult to get past this. It feels like X thing.
Yeah. Yes.
Even though, of course, how can you say anything about that, since you yourself are the machine that is attaching the reports and the labels to the report, saying things like, "This is what I feel right now," or "This is this is the sense that I have," and so you can't really trust that in a sense.
That's right. So you run into a circularity in thinking, which goes like this. Almost every argument about consciousness goes like this. Arguments in favor of what I would call the magicalist view. I know I have that inner experience because I directly experience it. Right? Now just think about how circular that is.
Yeah.
Because all you're saying is it's true because it's true. Because I experience it. The consciousness is the experience. All you're saying is, I know it's true because it's true. I know I have it because I have it. And if that's not a machine stuck in a logic loop, I don't know what is, right? That's what we have. Yeah. We have a machine computing information. The machine can think and report only information contained within it. And so the question facing us is, how and why does the machine compute that kind of information that leads it to make these strong claims about conscious experience?
Right. Now, I have a collaborator who feels that this is unfortunately something where one set of people believes one thing and the other believes another, and there's very little that you can do about that. And I still have hope that it's possible to take people through this thought process, to explain it to people. So I was wondering what you would tell your students to work their way through it and come out on the correct side, on the right answer.
I do think that at heart, people are very motivated by their emotions in hidden ways that all of us are. And we're biased and we just don't necessarily even realize it. And people want to believe in that magic essence inside of them. It's built into us to believe in that. It's very hard to get people to see otherwise. So you can walk people through the rational argument over and over and over. What I find is that people are so set on one way of thinking. It's not that they don't believe the other way. It's that they can't even understand the other way because they won't let their minds even follow the steps. But if you say it over and over, eventually it gets through. And I'm reminded of Newton discovering that white light is made up of a mixture of colors, right? And the reason why I'm reminded of that is because before Newton, the hard problem of color was why is white light purified and cleaned of all contaminants? And when you have red and blue and green light, how does it get contaminated? Right? That was the question of the day. And the reason why people were so certain that that's how it was is, again, because the brain constructed a simplified cartoonish model of something important in the world. And according to that simplified model, which was efficient and useful for survival but not accurate, according to that model, that's what color is. That's what white is. White is pure, stripped clean of contaminants. Right? So intuitively, at a deep down level, we all thought that. People all thought that. Newton comes along and proposes, no, white is a mixture of all colors, actually. And there was a backlash. People did not believe that. In fact, he was quite embittered by that. He had trouble publishing it, and his colleagues mocked it. And, that's normal. And it takes a long time for people to come around and realize that a rational argument, that the truth does not have to feel satisfying. It doesn't have to feel spiritually right. It just has to be logical and supported by data.
Yeah. So then if you were to say, try to describe what makes a good theory of consciousness, how would you go about, saying these are good theories of consciousness, those are bad theories of consciousness? Now, I know you've already said, they can't start with the feeling.
Yeah.
What else makes a good theory of consciousness?
Well, I think there's a very small pool of theories that are kind of, in a sense, the same theory from different angles, different perspectives, all converging. And so I'm not even sure there are multiple good theories of consciousness. I think that there's multiple keyhole perspectives on what's emerging as the likely truth. And so I'm very excited about our theory, the attention schema theory, but I do not see it as a rival to these other theories. So higher order thought theory is another one that says basically brains say, I have a subjective experience of X, of a red apple, because the brain contains information about the apple and information about how the brain processes. So the higher order thought theory is very similar in many ways. It's all about information content. And the a global workspace theory has been described different ways, and different people have different takes on it. And some of those takes are a bit magical. Information is broadcasted to the global workspace, and then magically you are subjectively aware of it. That would be a magical version of it. But elements of the global workspace are fit very nicely into this other more mechanistic approach. So there's all these different theories coming in. The approaches of Dan Dennett, the approaches of Sue Blackmore you mentioned, the approaches of Patricia Churchland, lots of these different approaches. And basically, although they don't all say it, they all kind of start from this perspective that a thing, a person, a system can't make a claim unless it contains the information on which the claim is based. And so you always have to trace back to what's computing information in this domain of consciousness, what it means to be conscious. What's computing that information and why is it computing it? And so it all comes down to this one little proposition that an entity can't make a claim unless it contains the information on which the claim is based. So, and like I said, it's all one theory. It's all converging. It's all pointing through little keyhole perspectives to that one underlying set of ideas.
Right. Yeah. And so there are, I guess, animals that create a self-model and to have attention and therefore can have consciousness in this sense. And there may be animals that don't have that.
Yes.
Do you have a sense for at what point, what sort of animals from an evolutionary point of view benefit from having what we call consciousness and having a system like that? So
if the particulars of the attention schema theory are correct, it's a little hard to tell about the particulars of the theory at this point. It looks like, as far as I can tell, you can find the highest levels kind of very sophisticated attention, sometimes called covert attention, or this ability to shift your focus to things in your periphery and things in your mind, and not always have your attention nailed to where your eyes happen to be pointing. So this more sophisticated kind of attention. You see this in mammals, in birds, and probably in some reptiles. Reptiles, of course, being the species from which the kind of animal from which mammals and birds both diverged, right? So that seems to be the range of animals in which you see this very sophisticated kind of attention that would need this kind of self-model for the brain to keep track of and control and monitor. And also, of course, species that need to attribute that kind of mental state to others. So species like humans who can attribute consciousness and awareness to others as a means of social intelligence, right? So this seems to be the range of animals that I'm guessing has what we would recognize as some kind of consciousness.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to dive too deep into that, but do you think that relates in some sense to goals, plans, imagination, that sort of thing?
I actually don't think so. Although, so I think that it's very easy to get, so if this approach is correct, what we call consciousness is actually a very confined thing. It's a very important little piece of the machine, and it can come in perhaps even quite early in evolution. I mean, we're talking 300 million years ago when proto-mammals began to diverge from reptiles, right? But it's a little piece of the larger machine. And there's lots of other very sophisticated pieces, imagination and memories, amazing memory ability and cognition and decision-making, and lots of these very complex pieces that also emerge and, of course, interact with the consciousness piece in complicated ways. But the consciousness piece itself is something that can, in principle, come in very early without some of these other sophisticated components.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that reminds me of a point that my friend Ken Hayworth, who works at Genelia and also runs the Brain Preservation Foundation, often says. He says people act as if consciousness is the thing that defines who they are, that is the thing that's unique about them in some sense. They'll say, my consciousness, and how could you possibly define or explain or copy or create or whatever a consciousness like mine, when really what they mean is their memory, that's the part that has all the unique parts, whereas consciousness is more like a processor of a certain kind, some sort of thing that you could exchange between people almost, in a sense. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, exactly. I think that so there's some terminological confusion, because at one point, consciousness meant, as William James first began to talk about it in about 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago now, he popularized the term stream of consciousness, by which he meant the content, the information in your consciousness. And nowadays, when people talk about consciousness, the scientists and philosophers, we're not that interested in the content of it. We're interested in how it gets to be conscious in the first place. And so I compare it to, imagine you have a bucket full of 1,000 little odds and ends, and you can study the odds and ends, and they're really rich and complicated, and every bucket has a different set of items in it, and everyone's very excited by that, and that's what defines you, is the particulars that are in your bucket. That's great, that's important. But the question of consciousness is, what's the bucket made out of? How do you get stuff in that bucket, and how does the bucket itself work? And that's something that's actually much simpler, I think. It's actually ironic that the so-called hard problem might be easier, and the easy problem of all the little details might be the hard one.
Indeed. We have reached the half-hour mark, so I definitely don't want to stretch this beyond the time that you have. But since I do have a conversation coming up in a couple of days with Christoph Koch, I was wondering if there's anything where you would say, hey, if you're talking to Christoph, definitely ask him this.
No, not really. I love Christoph. He's a friend, and we've had many good conversations, and he's a super nice guy. But I think he's not on the right track scientifically on this one. And I think my understanding, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but my understanding is that he feels from his upbringing, he's written a book about his religious upbringing and how some of that still lingers with him. And I think he has an emotional attachment to the idea of that non-physical essence inside of us that's very, very hard for people to shake. And the problem is, from my point of view, from the science point of view, the problem is it's the intuition is seductive, because it resonates with everything inside of us, and it's almost impossible to make yourself pry away from that intuition and say, just because it feels right doesn't mean it is right. The brain is designed to build models that are easy and efficient, but not literally accurate. So I think he's been seduced by that.
Okay, yeah, this has happened in physics as well, of course, where intuition leads you astray when you're thinking about the world in the very small or something like that.
Yes. But this is harder because it's an intuition about yourself, and everyone, of course, feels like an expert on themselves.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Is there anything else that you would absolutely want to mention in this interview, since that I haven't touched on, where you say, hey, this is something people should know?
I would say only this. People think the question of consciousness is philosophy, like dorm room philosophy or navel gazing or something like this. And I would say it's actually terribly important, because this is the basis for our technological future. As people build machines that have the same capabilities as people, this is going to change our future. And I've often said that the watershed moment in our history as a species is the moment we understand consciousness well enough to engineer it. So this has real pragmatic significance, and it's not just for the philosophers to debate.
All right. So just tacking back to the evolution question I was talking about, then there is a good reason to build machines that have consciousness, in a sense, right? That have a system like that.
Yes, it would be useful for the functioning of the machines. But I also think that people are going to build it anyway, because that's what people are. People think it's cool and exciting, and it's going to happen. Whether we like it or not, it's going to happen.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah.